All right, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's opening class. We're going to cover the two knights defense for black. An interesting variation within the two knights is called the fried liver attack. This is the initial moves after 3 moves, so I'll go through them from the start. White enters pawn to king 4 or e4. Black plays e5. You know, when the 2 king pawn comes out, that's called the double king pawn at this stage. This is the recommended opening that new chess players should learn first. And the reason is that the attacks and defenses, the attacks by white, defenses are straightforward and easier to understand. Some of the other openings, like the pawn to queen 4 or d4 and the English, they have a lot of maneuvering, and it's all positional sort of chess without all these direct attacks and defenses. So when you start out, you should concentrate on these openings first. So anyway, the best move for white is considered, well, first you bring out the center pawn, and that marks off the territory of each side. White gets the first 4 rows, black's territory are the top 4 rows. And as you can see, the pawns block each other, so black blocks the white pawn, it can't move forward. And in a way, that black pawn move neutralizes white's first pawn move. But the pawn moves let the bishop come out and the queen come out on the white diagonals, and they hold back the enemy pawns. For example, black can't play pawn to queen 4. Well, he could, but white can just take it. Black can take it back with the queen, but when you trade pawns, it opens up squares for your other pieces. But you don't make a lot of pawn moves in the opening. The main principle is to bring out the knights and bishops first. And after you do that, you want a castle. And then you want to maybe bring up another pawn in the center, and then bring your rooks to the middle of the board. That's called rapid development. Now, in rapid development, you don't want to move the same piece twice in the opening. For example, if you move the next move for white is this knight to f3. You know chess notation, right?
Yes.
All right, so that's the best move because it attacks the black pawn, which is undefended. And black then normally defends with the knight, and right off the bat on move 2, white is attacking and black is defending. White has a time advantage, the advantage of making the first move. That's in chess, that's called a time advantage. Every move is an element of time. And actually they're half moves. When white plays e4, that's half move. And when black plays e5, that's a half move. Together they make a move pair. And you write that on the score sheet because it's always white and black. So anyway, what we've done is 2 moves or 4 half moves. Again, black is defending, white is attacking. Because white has the first move advantage, he gets to be the attacker in the beginning of the game. That's also called the initiative, meaning the initiator of the action. Black is defending and responding. It's an advantage in chess to have the initiative. You know, in football, the team that wins is the team that can score the goal. So whoever has the football, they have the initiative in football. They're on the attack. That's what chess is. It's called the initiative. Now, one of the standard moves for move 3, white brings his bishop to c4. And see how it dominates that white diagonal toward the f7 pawn. So it's attacking the f7 pawn. It's defended by the king. Hi, we just started. We're going to go over the two knights defense for black. At this stage, it looks like it might be the Italian game, and it would be if black played his black bishop to c5, but we're going to go over the two knights where black plays knight to f6 and does a counterattack. We are going to do the knight to g5, and we're going to look at the fried liver attack. Oh, by the way, you guys should grab one of those handouts. It covers everything we're going to go over tonight. And you can read about it at your leisure at home. And I put a biography of the chess players behind the game, so you might read about the masters. Okay, so now you may not be, he's just started, so you may not be aware this setup typically leads to what's called the Italian game. And if black were to bring his bishop to c5 next to the white bishop, it would be the Italian opening. In Italian, it's called the Gioco Piano.
Gaucho piano.
How do you say that?
Gaucho piano.
Gaucho piano.
They say it in Italy.
And it's translated into English as the quiet game. They've been playing this opening since the 1400s. Was one of the first openings. When chess came over from India and Persia, they were first came to Italy with the trade routes, and that's what the Italians were playing, and the grandmasters still play this today. Anyway, the Italian game, if played correctly, any of the major openings, if both sides play correctly, it should result in a drawn game. White has the first move advantage. That lasts anywhere from 15 to 25 moves, depending on the opening. Some openings, the advantage dissipates faster, and some openings, it lasts longer. So white's goal is to keep the initiative going as long as possible and take advantage of any little mistakes black might make and increase his advantage. And if he gets a big enough advantage, he can win a pawn or a piece, and then that leads to a one game. All right, so the two knights, black knight comes out and counterattacks on that undefended white pawn on e5. e4. Right. Now, there are a lot of different ways to start from here for white. White could play d3. For example, white can play d4, but we're going to go over the knight up, which it violates an opening rule, which is what opening rule? Yeah. See how the knight moved twice? And we're only on move 4. But it has a strong threat. The knight and bishop attacked the f7 pawn, only defended by the king, so if white had another move, he'd win by knight takes pawn, attacking the queen and rook. So there are different ways black can play against that. So what black usually does at this point, he blocks the bishop diagonal with pawn up. So you can see that stops the knight takes f7 threat, at least temporarily. And white does pawn takes pawn, attacking the knight on c6. And here's where we diverge again into different black defenses. The one we're going to go through tonight is knight takes pawn. That allows white to sacrifice the knight on f7 and get a strong attack. He gets a pawn, and he can force the black king up to the middle of the board on the e6 square, which you'll see in a minute. My young chess students love the fried liver attack. One of my students who's like 12 years old, he says he always tries to play the fried liver attack. And I point out to him that you only get to play the fried liver attack if black is crazy and plays knight takes pawn. That gives white a very strong attack, the fried liver attack, and there's good alternative moves that are safe for black. In my opinion, one of the best moves, instead of the king knight taking the pawn, you move the knight to a5 and attack the bishop. You drive the bishop off the line of the pawn because the bishop has to move. It involves a pawn sacrifice. The bishop goes up check. You move the c7 pawn up one square and attack the bishop. That lets white do pawn takes pawn, then he's a pawn up. You take back with the pawn. He normally retreats the bishop to e2 in front of the king, and black gets to drive the white pieces back and gets compensation for the pawn. It's considered to lead to an even position. It's a good, safe, and aggressive way to play for black. So there's no need for black to go into the fried liver attack. But for variety, the fried liver attack gets quite complicated and is fun. It's particularly fun in speed chess on the internet or here at the chess club, but it's not recommended for tournament play. And look over here, you can see that these grandmasters, high-rated grandmasters, they're playing the World Championship Blitz tournament in Doha in 2016. Well, guess when I have a database of grandmaster games, it's updated through 2017. Every year it updates. And I looked up the fried liver attack to see how many grandmasters actually played the game. Guess how many grandmaster games showed up? Anybody? One. This one. And it was only a speed chess game. So you can see that's why I say the fried liver attack is an interesting sideline. So we'll jump into this game. So this is the move that lets white initiate the attack. And white takes the pawn. Of course, the king has to take. Now the queen comes up with a double attack, checking the king and attacking the knight. The knight's only defended once, it's attacked twice, so the king has to go up one square to protect the knight, or he loses the knight, and white would get his piece back plus a pawn, and the black king would have moved and can't castle, so black would be lost. So he's trying to hold on to the piece. At this point, white only has one pawn. He needs two more pawns, theory-wise, to be even. But he has a strong attack. That black king blocks the bishop on c8. The black king gets in the way of his pieces, and white gets good attack. So here's white's next move. He immediately brings his knight out, and of course now he has three pieces attacking the knight. And he can't, because the king blocks the bishop, he can't defend it with the bishop. The only way, there's only, who in the audience, there's two moves he can make to defend the knight. What are they? You must know this. What are they?
Knight e7 and then knight b4.
Same knight to b4. The c knight goes either up to b4 or back to e7. Now here's the harder question. Which of those two moves is better for black? And why?
This is an opening I haven't actually played ever.
Well, just use your general chess knowledge, and it doesn't matter if you're right or not. Just make a guess.
Me personally, I would do knight b4, threatening to take on c2.
That is actually the best move. And it's a slight difference, but that's better. And if you put the knight back to e, the problem with bringing the knight to b4, at a certain point, the knight might be exposed to a pawn attack a3, but you do have that threat of knight takes pawn check, winning the rook, and then you'd have lots of material. And the other benefit, there's a drawback to knight to d7.
Plus the bishop.
And the queen, but mainly the bishop. So that's why the knight to b4 is better, because the bishop can come out and help defend either the e pawn. If it goes to d6, it can't go to d6 because it'd give up the knight, but it can go to e7 and guard some squares toward the black king. Now in this game, black, who is Simon Agdestein, I looked up his biography because I read a note about him. He's an interesting grandmaster. He's from Norway. Who's the most famous chess player from Norway?
Magnus Carlsen.
World champion. This guy was a coach to Magnus Carlsen when Magnus was coming up and becoming really good. He's no longer his coach, but he brought Magnus a long way toward becoming a great grandmaster.
It says about it in actually the Play Magnus app.
Does it?
Yeah, it said I like one of the pages. It said that Magnus finally beat his coach.
Oh, okay. So this guy's very interesting, and he's playing, I think, a Russian. I'm not sure though. He might be Ukrainian or some other nationality. But it's in the biography at the back. Anyway, they're both very good players. Black chooses what we just said was the less desirable move, knight to e7. So we'll jump into that. We'll come back and I can show you the alternate. Notice the chess notation over there where the moves are. See the plus over minus? Do you know how to read those chess notation symbols?
Not the plus over minus. What is that?
Well, plus over minus means a big advantage, not a winning advantage, a big advantage for white. Now, if you invert the symbol so it's minus over plus, it's a big advantage for black. Now, a big advantage means you're starting to approach a value of a pawn, which is 1 point. Now see the little number in parentheses behind the move? That's what the chess engine, I use a chess computer engine to evaluate the moves, and it gives us a point score based at 1 is 1 pawn. So 1.3 means 1 1/3 pawns. It's close to a winning advantage. Now, a winning advantage is, for white, is a plus on a straight line with a minus sign to the right of it.
Winning position.
And a winning position for black would be a minus sign and then a plus. You see the black being the second, the symbol on the right, white being the symbol on the left. Now they also have a smaller advantage, a slight advantage. That's a plus over an equal sign. That's worth about 1/3 of a pawn, 0.3, 0.35. And a completely equal position, and that is anything under 0.3 of a pawn, so 0.20 would be equal, is an equal sign. So those are the major things you would need to know when you see these things in a computer. Okay, let's see what white does. So white has almost a winning advantage here. Now, so there's no knight takes c2, White chooses to castle. It's a good move. There's an equally good move. What would be another good move for white in this position? Who in the audience sees another good attacking move for white? That king is on the E file, right? And after white castles and the rook goes to the E file, it would be check, except there's a pawn or piece blocking the black king, right? Well, you could try to attack that pawn on E5 to eliminate it, and that would expose the black king. So that's the other good move. What's the other good move then?
Just do pawn d4.
That's right. And he can hardly do pawn takes pawn. He can't do pawn takes pawn. You can do queen to e4 check, driving the king away from the knight. Then you would win the knight with knight takes knight. So the computer says that if you do, anyway, it says d4 is a good move. And d4 is move 9, and 10 moves later, the computer says white still has a big advantage, 1.43. A little bit better, but anyway, castles is also good, so we'll stick with that. Obviously, that knight on d5 needs more protection, doesn't it? It's not moving, it's pinned. How can we protect the knight? Yeah, so c6. In both lines, whether that knight goes back to e7 or b4, they play c6. So that's what happens, c6. Now you're going to see a transposition. White chose to castle first. Now he hits the e5 pawn with d4, like I told you. And it's not an exact transposition. Had white played d4 first, black might have played a different move, or there might be a slightly different move order. Or it could transpose. Anyway, black wants to get his king out of the center because he's really exposed. There's going to be rook to e1, threatening rook takes pawn check. And pawn takes pawn, he gets rook to e1 check right away. And there's a bishop to f4 check if he goes to d6. So black chooses to move his king back. That unblocks the bishop on the white squares that can come up. And the king is going to try to hide on c7 behind his pawn on c6. White has a good attacking move. He develops his bishop, pinning the knight to the queen, and now the two rooks are connected, so they can come to the center files and join in on the king attack. So we're at move 11. Remember, this is a speed chess game, probably 5 minutes. It could be something else. The grandmasters didn't have a lot of time, and I don't think I know that black didn't know the opening, because at this moment on move 11, black makes a losing blunder. So obviously he didn't know the details of the opening. He was probably just playing it for fun. Okay, so he plays the losing move, bishop to e6. Now look at the notation. See the two question marks? In this notation, one question mark is a bad move. That might be your valuation. Say you were even, an equal game, and you make a bad move. You might drop a third of a pawn. So if you're black, white might have a 0.35 advantage. But a double question mark, that's a change from equal to losing. That's called a blunder. So this is a blunder, And I got a little note. Look how it changed. The valuation for white jumps up to 2.22. See the parentheses? A grandmaster can usually win with an advantage of 1 pawn or more. So 2.22 is 2 1/5 pawns. Most grandmasters will win unless they run out of time and make a blunder in turn and let their opponent back into the game. Okay. We'll go through this because it'll wrap up, and then we'll double back and show you what he should have played. Okay. The problem with that move, it turns out that the bishop on e6, remember the king was on e6 and we said the rook would come over and attack the e file. Well, it turns out that putting the bishop on e6, the bishop becomes a target of the rook. And the king's not safe on that black square. After that pawn goes away, there's a bishop to f4 check. And there's a knight to e4 check on the king. See those? So the black king's not safe either. So white plays rook over, threatening rook takes pawn, and then the rook is right on the bishop, and the other rook, he can double up and threaten rook takes bishop check. Black tries, pawn takes pawn. Now there's a couple ways to win. And I'm going to show you the alternative because it's short. White plays knight here check, which should win. But there might even be an easier win. White could have played queen to g3 check on that black diagonal. That drives the king back to the white square. And now watch this. You sacrifice the rook. King takes, so we got the king back in the middle. Now we take the knight. Remember, his other knight isn't really defending d5 because it can't move. The queen would be lost. Pawn takes. Now we have our rook over check. Now the rook and bishop are on the knight on e7. The king moves. Then we have queen to the white diagonal to keep the king from hiding on c8. Where can the little king go? The king can go here. If the king goes here, the bishop drops here, and then where does the king go?
King c6.
Up here. But notice the rook can come and attack the king on this rook here check.
And then forces to go to king.
Then he has to come, the king has to come up here, and he's almost checkmated. Well, yeah, we got bishop here check, and if king takes bishop, we got queen here checkmate. He can't move the king. The best the computer can come up with is start to giving pieces back. He plays the knight up. Notice the bishop's on the queen, and we get the knight with check. King to c7. Well, this is simple. So here we have a rook. After a rook takes bishop, we still have a bishop, so that offsets. We have a queen for a rook. An easy one game. So you can see that right here, white missed an easy win with queen to g3, and I guess he probably missed this rook sacrifice. Okay, but anyway, he plays knight here, and this should win too, if he follows up. Where does the king go now? Who in the audience, what would be the right move now? There's only one. He has to go back. Does he go to D7 or C7? If he goes to D7, we get a knight fork, knight to C5 check, attacking the king and bishop, and the rook's on the bishop. We win the bishop with the knight and we attack the queen, and we have a winning attack. So the only move is to try here. Now white plays queen to G3 check. He can't go to D7. And C8's not very good either because we have knight to C5 attacking the bishop. So he tries king to B6. Who sees a strong move for attacking move for white here? Hello? How can we check the black king?
Queen B3.
Yeah, queen to B3. That's a very strong move. It forces the king back to C7. And white doesn't see the winning move. It's quite simple.
Knight C5.
Yeah, what's the threat?
Capturing on B7.
And taking the bishop on E6. So let's look at it. Knight to C5. He has to retreat the bishop to C8 to protect the B7 pawn. Now what's the winning move? This is a real tricky move. That's why white missed this. Very tricky move for white. I'll just show it to you. I wouldn't think of it. He drops his rook in. The bishop can't take it because knight takes would fork the king and queen. Now, believe it or not, that rook is headed for this square. The bishop can check. Well, the queen can check here, and the rook can come here, and the king has no good squares to go to. But I'll show you. So let's say black tries D3. Now the knight is we want to check here, but the knight's guarding that. So we get rid of the knight. And if pawn takes knight, we get our bishop check. Black tries queen takes knight. That breaks the pin on the black knight, but it's too late. Bishop here check. Where does the king go?
King D8.
And now what do we do?
Rook to D6.
Yeah, supported by the bishop, and we pick up the queen for a rook, and we win the game. Very nice win right here. All white had to do was knight here, and because of queen takes pawn check, the only move is bishop back and dropping the rook in, and he gets that rook on E6 and actually forks the king and queen, which is interesting. Okay, however, white, it's only a 5-minute game, so he didn't have a lot of time to figure it out. So he repeats moves. When you're running out of time, you often repeat checks because you make a move and you can think while your opponent's making his move. Okay, he goes back. Now white should just repeat and then do the knight to C5 move again, but he doesn't see that. Now he plays another move which should win, knight to D6. What's white has a threat. What's white's threat?
First, rook takes E6.
E6. Rook takes the bishop on E6.
And then,
Well, once he gets that, then he would have knight to F7 forking the queen and rook. Okay. This should win. Look at the valuation. White is ahead 3.04 pawns. 3 pawns, that's the equivalent of a piece ahead. It should be an easy win. Black plays queen to d7. It protects the bishop. And now white makes a bad move. Remember, white was up 3 pawns, 3.04, and he doesn't see the winning move. He plays a4. It's not a bad move. It threatens pawn up check with a strong attack. But notice how the point valuation drops to 1.19 from 3. So it went from 3 pawns up to 1 pawn, to just barely a win. All right, so what he should have done, once again, he should have brought the queen over here, check, king back here. Notice now he can take that pawn. Now the king gets the knight, but we pick up the rook. Okay, so we have 2 bishops. That takes care of black's 2 bishops. We have a rook. Black has a rook. We have another rook. So he has 2 knights versus a rook. But his king position, his rook's not developed. He can't move the bishop on f8. And he's got 5 pawns. White has 6 pawns. Material's even. But black's position is so hopelessly bad, he's lost. I didn't put the point valuation, but it's a big plus for white. In fact, the obvious threat, if it was white's move, he would go here, check. If the queen blocks the check, we would have rook takes bishop check. Draw, no, I take that back. The knight protects. Well, before we do the queen check, I guess we'd have to take some of the knights off. But anyway, black has a win. But after a4, it's not so clear. Well, I have a few more moves. Black plays a5, a good move. It gives his king an escape square and it blocks the pawn to keep it from going to a5 check. White plays his queen up, protecting the knight. Black plays his knight over, opening his bishop on the knight and attacking the queen. Only one move for white. What is it? He has to move the queen. He doesn't want to lose the knight.
Why not just queen takes d4 check?
Exactly. That's the right move. Because you get the queen out of the way. You win a pawn. Now he attacks you. Now he's still on your knight. What's your move now? Looks like he's going to get the knight. You just drop back to d3. He does get the knight. But you bring your other rook over. You threaten to get the piece back with bishop takes knight. He can't protect the knight with the rook over because the bishop on g5 guards the d8 square. So he has to try to drive the bishop back. Now we have a nice move. Rook takes. The bishop was protecting the knight. Queen takes. Bishop takes knight on the queen. So we got 2 pieces for a rook. Now notice that if black could somehow survive the attack, he's a whole rook up. But white has basically a mating attack. Black makes his second blunder of the game. He plays queen to d6. What's the winning move? Any guesses from the audience?
Queen to D5.
Yeah, queen to B5 will work. He actually played queen to B3, but it goes to the same thing. You get the pawn on B7, and not only get the pawn, that's a checkmate. So obviously, black must have been out of time to make that bad second blunder, but he's lost anyway. He has to guard this. He has to guard this pawn because this check is going to threaten to take the pawn. Rook here won't cut it because queen here check, king here, queen takes pawn. Well, then he could drop the queen here. No, well, we're on the queen. He has to move the queen, and he has to protect this pawn. Okay, so the only way to do that is to go here. But then, notice this knight is attacked, and the queen was protecting the knight and had to move to protect against the checkmate, so it left the knight hanging. Okay, so now we have black is a rook for a bishop, but again, white has a killer attack. King back. You drop back the bishop, so you're attacking rook on the queen. The queen has to move. Tries to trade queens. Does trade queens. But then we put our bishop safely, and the king comes up, and we're going to take the computer's word for it. See the valuation, 0.93, a big plus, almost a pawn up. White has winning chances, put it that way. There's not a sure win, but winning chances. So black could have held on longer had he played the right move, but black blundered in time trouble and white got a checkmate. Okay. Now let's go back a little bit because there's some alternatives here. So this is where we started out. This is the two knights defense. It's named after the two black knights coming out. And white came up. We played d5, e takes, and black did knight takes. And that, remember, is not the recommended move. The recommended move is knight to a5, attacking the bishop. All right, now white did knight takes f7. And white had great fun with a strong attack. It turns out that white could have had a moderate advantage or a small advantage without sacrificing any piece. That's another point. Sacrificing a piece to do the fried liver attack is unnecessary. White can get an advantage with another move. Notice that the queen is threatening queen takes knight. The other good move is pawn the queen 4, attacking the center pawns, and the bishop protects the knight at the same time. Black's best move is just to take the pawn. Now, that's move 6. White drives the knight back. The knight can't move because we would win the knight on d5. Black has a couple tricks up his sleeve to try to hold on to keep from losing a piece. He attacks the bishop. Bishop drops back. Then he attacks the knight. White is attacking the knight. Black is attacking white's knight. What's the right move for white?
Capture the knight with the pawn.
That is possible, but there's a better move. you're going to lose your knight, so why not take something with your knight before you take his knight?
You mean knight takes...
Pawn. Yeah, knight takes f7. You're going to lose the knight anyway, so the idea, it's called a desperado. You're going to lose the knight. If you can take the knight and make a threat, you can win a pawn, and you can make the king come up so he can't castle. And without the pawn on f7, white gets attacking lines on the white diagonals. So the best move is knight takes. So the only move is king takes. And now we have time to take the knight. Now, black is behind in development, so his best move is to move his bishop out, checking white. White's best move is to block with the bishop. Now, black doesn't do bishop takes bishop check because that would help white develop his knight by knight takes bishop, and then the knight can come up to e4. So black takes the center pawn, and white comes up queen to f3 check, and the black king retreats behind the pawn. But notice, when the king goes behind the pawn, he blocks his rook in the corner. That gives white an advantage. White can castle and bring his rooks to the middle and attack with both rooks. Black's going to take a long time to get his rook out of the corner. So white has a positional advantage. So white castles. Now, black's position is kind of weak. White could take this pawn, and once he takes this pawn, the bishop can go here and pin the knight to the king and threaten bishop takes knight. So this knight needs to be protected in the worst way. So the best move is to bring the bishop to protect, but now we hit the bishop with our rook. There's an opening principle. If you can develop a rook or some other piece and make a threat, you gain a tempo to develop another piece. So we attack the bishop, he has to retreat the bishop, and then we get to develop another piece. So he retreats. Now we take his bishop. Knight takes. Now he's on our bishop. We just let him take our bishop. No, we don't. I take that back. We need the bishop for attacking the white squares, and we gain a tempo with the bishop move attacking the rook. The rook moves. What piece haven't we developed yet for white? The knight. So the knight comes out. Now let's evaluate the position. This is where we're going to stop. Without sacrificing a piece, white has 5 pawns. Black has an extra pawn. But look at black's pawns. They're all ragged and separated. They're all very weak, and all the diagonals on the white squares are weak. Black's rook is stuck in the corner by the king. The king can't move up to h7 to let the rook out because the bishop guards the h7 square. White, even though he's a pawn down, has a big a moderate advantage. And the computer says white's advantage is 0.38 plus over equals. 0.38, that's almost 0.4. That's 4/10 of a pawn. 2/5 of a pawn. So it's almost half a pawn. That's a good advantage. It's not a winning advantage. Black will be lucky to survive. So you can see that had white didn't have to do the sacrifice going to the fried liver attack. He could have had a safe advantage by playing d4. All right. Now, we're going to go into the fried liver attack. And remember, in our game, knight takes, king, queen here, king here, knight here. We did the retreat. Well, it turns out we said earlier that the knight up was better. Let's take a quick look at that. All right. So, this is better. See the notation. After this move, white has a slight advantage. Plus over equals 0.63. 6/10 of a pawn. You divide 6 by 2 and 10 by 2, you get 3/5. 3/5 is more than half a pawn. This is a bigger advantage actually than playing the pawn to queen 4. But it goes for a long time. We got to go for move 8. And I did had the computer play the moves out to move 35, and white was able to increase his advantage. But I don't know that all the moves were forced. We'll run through them. White's best move is castles. Once again, black protects the knight with the c6 move. We do the pawn to queen 4 attack. But now the knight, when it went to e7, blocked the queen, so the queen has a better defensive move coming up trying to trade queens. White can't afford to trade queens or he loses the attack, so he retreats, but he's still on the e5 pawn. Now the king goes back to e7. He doesn't go to d7 or d6. But we get a pawn. Now we got 2 pawns for the piece, and we're attacking the queen. Queen goes over to the white square. Now we bring our knight to the middle. And see, he gets his bishop out. He didn't get his bishop out in the other variation because the king was blocking the bishop, remember? So black's queen and bishop are in a much better square than in the other in the game, the other variation. Now we don't have a great move with the knight, so we just defend it. Now black doesn't take the knight because we do pawn takes knight, driving black's best knight, the defending knight, on d5 away, and it would open up the f-file for the rook. Black's best move is to reorganize his knights. He retreats that knight, attacking the bishop. We retreat here. Now he's going to move his king away from the middle. We get rook to d1. See how he hides the king behind the c6 pawn. And there's no check here because this pawn's in the way. What does that suggest to you would be a good move? We can give that pawn up, can't we? We just throw the pawn away because we want to open up the diagonal for our bishop. He doesn't take the pawn because we'd have bishop to f4 check. He plays this knight back, and it takes away the bishop to f4 check move. However, now we can drive that knight away from d5 with the move c4. We're on the knight. And if the knight moves, we get bishop to f4 check. Well, black needs to get rid of some of these attacking pieces. Now he takes the knight. We don't take the bishop. We take the knight. Black can get his black squared bishop out with check. We don't waste time moving the king. We need to develop our bishop. We give up on the bishop to f4 check. We want to get our rooks together, so we trade bishops. That helps black's defense somewhat. And now black takes the pawn with bishop takes d5, threatening our e6 pawn, so we take the bishop, knight takes. Now watch this. We're a whole piece down, and it looks like black has successfully defended his position. But white has the rook sacrifice, queen up check. See how the pawn on e6 works with the queen? He can't go to b8 it would be queen to d6 check, king to c8, rook to c1 would be checkmate. He has to go to d8. Now the king and pawn are lined up and we bring our rook over and we get rook takes pawn check. He moves the king over. We take the pawn with the queen, threatening queen down check.
Wait, why didn't he take the pawn again?
Where? Here?
Yeah.
He went here.
But why didn't he take
No, like, why didn't, go to rook d1?
Why can't he take the pawn on e6?
Yeah,
Okay.
queen takes e6. Why not that? Oh,
We take with the rook. Where does the king go?
Oh, whoops.
He goes here.
Oh,
Then we pin him. And it turns out we win this because we're going to win one of the two, either the g7 pawn or the b7 pawn, and we're going to have an extra pawn on each side of the board maybe. We can move our king safe, we can move our h pawn up a couple pawns, and the king can hide on h2, and the queen can nurse the pawns up, and the rooks aren't going to be able to hold it off. Now the rooks can hold off the queen if the pawns are even and the rooks protect each other and they protect the pawns, then it's a draw. Not a draw in this case. Okay, so he had to move the king out of the way, and now we do queen takes, threatening queen down. He comes up here, queen down, king to f8, watch this. E7, he can't go up because we have pawn up double check. That would lead to checkmate. King over. Now we have queen here. Only move is to block. Queen here check. Only move is to block. Watch this. We have a perpetual check if we wanted, a draw by perpetual check. We try to win. Queen here, threatening rook to d8. Rook to c8. We do rook to d8 anyway. He has to take our queen. We take his queen. We get his other rook. See that? And we win the h pawn. We're a pawn up and we have winning chances in the ending. 1.01 advantage, approximately a pawn. Now I couldn't win this ending, but grandmasters have winning chances if they play it just right. So I stopped the analysis here. So even if black played better, white does have some winning chances. That's why black should never let white play the fried liver attack. So remember that. Don't play into the fried liver attack. But if you want to have fun in speed chess, it would be great fun to try these things out. I doubt very much. Most chess players would have no idea of all these maneuvers that the computer came up with. So anyway, that should wrap it up. Thanks for coming tonight.